Hi, I'm Brittany Sharkey, and I'm both your compounding field officer and your coach for the CompEX implementation program. Today I'll be bringing you a risk assessment video to help you comply with the NAPR model standards for pharmacy compounding of non-sterile preparation. The purpose of a risk assessment is to provide a foundation for eliminating or minimizing worker exposure to hazardous drugs in the workplace. It will help you identify the appropriate level of steps that you need to take to minimize the contamination of each product you compound and assess the cumulative risk of all compounds prepared in your pharmacy. The total risk must be considered even when small quantities of low-risk preparations are all compounded within the same time frame. Before we walk through an actual example, let's review the NAPR requirements. Each pharmacy should develop a list specific to their pharmacy of the drugs and materials that are used, including hazardous drugs and materials. The requirements for safe compounding of all materials should be researched and documented. Some useful references to use for assessing risk can be found listed in Section 4.3 of the NAPR Model Standards for Pharmacy Compounding of Non-Sterile Preparations Guidance document. NAPR requirements include the following. Document the risk assessment, clearly explaining how risks to personnel and the preparation have been mitigated. Documentation of rationale for risk assessment must be on the master formulation record and must include the following. Procedures for mitigation risk, references for procedures and rationale, must be clear to all pharmacy personnel, drug exposure issues, personnel protective equipment needs, drug exposure limits, and standards of practice to ensure proper handling and cleanup. When conducting a risk assessment, you want to consider what is the risk to the preparation and what is the risk to the compounding personnel. The preparation must be compounded in an area free of interruption from other activities within the pharmacy. The area must be large enough to store all compounding equipment and ingredients. The compounder must ensure that nothing in the surrounding area contaminates the preparation from being compounded. The compounding area must be contained so that it does not create a hazardous environment for others. The compounder must be protected from materials that may be hazardous or harmful. You will also want to consider the following while completing your risk assessment. Complexity of compounding the preparations, need for verification and uninterrupted workflow, frequency of compounding high risk or low risk preparations, risk of cross-contamination with other products, concentration of ingredients in the product, quantity of ingredients being handled, physical characteristics of ingredients, education and competency of compounding personnel, availability of appropriate facilities and equipment, handling precautions and personal protective equipment needed as outlined in the safety data sheet, the type of hazardous drug, exposure to compounding personnel for each preparation and accumulation of exposure over time, the risk of microbial contamination to the preparation, and the classification of ingredients if identified by WMIS as presenting a health hazard or a drug that is classified by NIOSH as hazardous. WMIS stands for the Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, and NIOSH stands for the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. To illustrate the use of this map, we will be conducting a risk assessment for methadone, demonstrating how it is determined that methadone must be compounded under Level B requirements. On that note, let's begin. The first thing to consider is the product found in Table 1 of the NIOSH list, antineoplastic drugs. No, methadone is not. Second thing to consider, is the product found in Table 2 or 3 of the NIOSH list of dangerous drugs, or is the product listed as a health hazard under the Hazardous Products Act? No, methadone is not. Third thing to consider, is the compound simple, moderate, or complex as defined by USP? USP Chapter 795 breaks non-sterile compounding down into 3 categories: Let's take a moment to review the USP 795 definitions of simple, moderate, and complex. There are three types of simple non-sterile compounds. First, the non-sterile compound has a USP compounding monograph. Second, the non-sterile compound appears in a peer-reviewed journal article that contains specific quantities of all components, compounding procedure, and equipment and stability data for that formulation and appropriate beyond use dates. And third, reconstituting or manipulating commercial products that may require the addition of one or more ingredients as directed by the manufacturer. This type of simple non-sterile compound does not require any further documentation, such as the compounding record. There are two types of moderate non-sterile compounds. First, the non-sterile compound requires special calculations or procedures, such as calibration of dosage unit mold cavities to determine quantities or components used in the non-sterile compound, or an individualized dosage units. Or second, the non-sterile compound does not have specific stability data available, such as mixing two or more manufactured cream products when the stability of the mixture is not known. Complex non-sterile compounds. The non-sterile compound requires special training, environment, facilities, equipment, and procedures to ensure appropriate therapeutic outcomes. Now, when reviewing the USP definitions for simple, moderate, and complex non-sterile compounds, let's review the previously mentioned risk assessment factors for methadone. The complexity of compounding methadone powder into a solution is generally overall a very simple process from a procedural standpoint. However, when compounding any preparation, you do want to ensure that you have an uninterrupted workflow. Methadone is a powder being compounded into a solution, and when working with powders, there's always dust that is being generated into the surrounding air and surfaces in the work environment. Upon reviewing the safety data sheet for methadone, it states the following in regards to exposure controls and personal protection. For engineering controls, must use process enclosure, local exhaust ventilation, or other engineering controls to keep airborne levels below recommended exposure limits. If user operations generate dust, fume, or mist, use ventilation to keep exposure to airborne contaminants below the exposure limit. Note that it also states that exposure limits are not available. Therefore, the precautionary measures must always be taken. For personal protection, you need safety glasses, a lab coat or a disposable gown, a certified dust respirator, and gloves. The safety data sheet also lists the WHMIS classification for methadone as D1A, material causing immediate and serious toxic effects. Based upon the review of the information in the safety data sheet, it outlines that WHMIS classifies methadone as highly toxic, requiring the need for proper facilities and personal protective equipment to ensure that pharmacy staff is protected and the environment is not contaminated. Based on these factors, methadone is classified as a complex non-sterile compound. Based on all of these factors and the information outlined, methadone falls into the level B classification, requiring a separate room that is either well ventilated or have a containment ventilated enclosure installed. If it is necessary to compound a preparation with procedures and processes that are not currently in place within the pharmacy, the documentation should include the following: the potential risks, the extra steps that must be taken to mitigate the risks, the references that validate these steps will actually minimize risks to the quality of the product and the safety of the personnel. Safety data sheets and other applicable references must be consulted, and appropriate procedures for safe compounding must be documented on the master formulation record for each compound. The risk assessment must be reviewed at least every 12 months to ensure that it is still valid. I hope that this overview of a risk assessment of methadone has provided some clarification to the statement in the most recent CompEX edition of Microscope, stating that all methadone pharmacies must meet level B requirements. Now let's talk quantities. When reviewing risk assessment considerations, small quantity and large quantity is often referred to. Unfortunately, NAPRA does not outline any specific numbers in correlation to small or large quantities. When it comes to quantities, it depends on the following. What is the drug? Toxicity, chemistry, volatility, form being used, and type of compounding to occur. What is the exposure and cumulative dose concerns? How can staff be exposed, and what is the actual concern? Do your current contamination strategies protect the compounding and non-compounding pharmacy staff? Do you and your staff feel safe working in this environment after reviewing the exposure risks and safety data sheets? Defining a large quantity. Recognize the potential harmful effects: carcinogenic, mutagenic, or teratogenic potential, alterations to normal blood cell count, fetal loss in pregnant women and potential birth defects developed, abnormal pain, hair loss, nasal sores or vomiting, liver damage, contact dermatitis, local toxic or allergic reaction or irritation to the skin. How much can actually cause harm? It's not only an acute dose, it's the chronic exposure over the span of one's work experience or career. Each drug must be assessed for exposure limits. Each drug must be assessed for harm to the workers involved in the handling of those drugs. Non-antineoplastic. The therapeutic dose, though safe for a patient, is not appropriate for staff to be exposed to. The preparation was prescribed to the patient for a reason. It is not a medication that the compounding personnel needs, therefore they should not be exposed to it. When reviewing large quantities on a regular basis, consider: how much are you working with daily? Run basic reports on an average day. Run a report for cumulative total for a week. Review average over days in operation, and consider what is the daily average. Does this qualify as a large quantity? Remember, the risk assessment and documentation is a tool for your pharmacy to determine appropriate safety procedures and infrastructure for your pharmacy practice. The pharmacy owns this decision. Therefore, are you doing everything in your power to protect your pharmacy staff and prevent harm? Can you justify what you're doing with reputable references? It is an employer's responsibility to ensure that their staff are provided a safe environment to work in. In the OH&S regulations, it states the following. From Section 12, the duties of an employer at a place of employment include: A, the provision and maintenance of plant, systems of work, and working environments that ensure, as far as is reasonably practicable, the health, safety, and welfare at work of the employer's workers. B, arrangements for the use, handling, storage, and transport of articles and substances in a manner that protects the health and safety of workers. C, the provision of any information, instruction, training, and supervision that is necessary to protect the health and safety of workers at work. And D, the provision and maintenance of a safe means of entrance to and exit from the place of employment and all work sites and work-related areas in or on the place of employment. Thank you for joining me in this video, and please remember that I'm here to help you in every step along the way in meeting compliance with the NAPRA model standards for pharmacy compounding of non-sterile preparations.